Sigrid, I want to start by asking you, well, I know this, but asking you for everyone else's benefit to share with us, where are you and what's something that you've been through today? It can be a small thing. It doesn't have to be a big life-changing thing.
Where I'm at home in my Manhattan apartment, and okay, something that I did go through today, as I started to tell you earlier, and as some people who are listening were actually present. I had a meltdown because I was trying to just to sign on to Zoom to teach my workshop at BU this morning, and I couldn't get on, and then I just I get kind of lost it, and my students all helped me get through that, and I did. But it was I mean, we talked about this before about how these things just become outsized. They're just small aggravations, reminding me of how they say mental health is the ability to deal with frustration.
Oh my God, we all need such robust mental health right now.
Yeah,
And
it's
we're
true.
facing such challenges to it. Um, it's so interesting. So you went through sort of a Zoom crisis today.
Yes.
Before everyone was, before all of you in the audience joined us, Sigrid and Maris and I were doing one of those things that we only do now during the pandemic, which is we were talking obsessively about the way our Zoom screens looked, and we were all working together to try to eliminate the bizarre reflection from my glasses. We failed, so there you go. Sorry, but what this made me think of, and I'm getting a. I'm actually going to interrupt right now to get input. Someone in the chat says they're having a problem with the sound. Maris, is our sound okay?
As far as I can tell, it's okay. Is anyone else okay, no other problems? Might be a personal thing. I think we should keep going.
Okay, and if there's something that can be helpful to the audience member who is having sound difficulty, maybe we can put that into the chat. So we've talked already a lot about sort of our Zoom reality. Sigrid, something that I was really struck by, both while reading this amazing book and while thinking about it again today. I read it the instant it landed in my hands, which I think was prior to publication, and I read it. Really, I won't go on and on about my reactions and my experience, but I was enthralled by the book. I read it. I devoured it very, very quickly. And then I went back and thought about it a lot. And one of the things that I noticed, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, is um, there's a huge role played in your book by chance encounters, the sorts of chance encounters that we can't have right now and that have become almost kind of unimaginable. Physical proximity. There's all sorts of physical proximity in your book, and it's really, really important. The narrator happens to go to a lecture by a prominent public intellectual because she happens to be in a certain town where she's visiting a hospitalized friend. The narrator shares with us the story of this kind of interesting, I don't know what the name is for these relationships that you have with people that you see at the gym that you don't actually know, but you go to the same gym with them for years and years and years, and you sort of observe the changes that they go through, both bodily and maybe personality wise. So your book really excelled at depicting these chance encounters between people. And can you talk about that a little bit, just in terms of how it feels to be publishing this? Because I guess what I want to say is that this book felt like it was so much about this moment, and in a very strange inverse way, because it's depicting this mode of relationship that we don't get to have right now. Did you think of that?
Well, I mean, the book begins, and I think it's on the first page or so, where it says it was the third week of September, 2017. And I finished the book last September, and then how many months later did the whole world change with what's been going on? So I don't, it's all just chance that the way the book seems to be of the moment. In that sense, also there is there is a feeling about the isolation in the book, because the two women, the two friends, they go off to quarantine themselves in a way, and so that was a very odd coincidence. But mostly it was just that you do go about your day, and you do, when you're living in this kind of, in an urban environment, you always, if you're alone and you're dining alone or something, or you're in a coffee shop and you're not talking to anyone else. And I'm not somebody who who goes around with earbuds, so whatever's going on, I can hear it, I can observe it. And it has always struck me what that's like to, if you're listening to the things that people say to each other, like the conversation early in the book, she overhears something in a bar. She has her back to this father and daughter. But that was such a significant conversation, and an unsettling one. And then, if you're in this kind of environment, you have your friends and your close people, but you also have all these acquaintances. I would call them gym buddies. And, really, as my narrator said, she's been going to the same gym for all these years. Now I can't go to the gym. Right? I mean, that's one of the things that I miss, not being able to go to the gym. And then, we live in these places where we have lots of neighbors.
Right.
And there's some kind of relationship with all of them. And so that's always intrigued me, that you meet people, and if you're open to it, they will tell you stories. It's like I.B. Singh said, when somebody asked him, where do you get your stories? He said, if you're a doctor, the good Lord sends you patients. And if you're a writer, he sends you stories. And the stories come from other people. And I wanted, none of them, except for the story of the woman who's dying, was appropriate for the grand treatment. It was, but it was just it was anecdotal, or just a snippet of life, or a slice of life, or, I wanted to catch these people at certain moments.
Right.
But it's very odd how, trying to relate the book to the time now, because it really did take place, the book does take place in a time that was not that long ago, but where things were completely different.
I think that's why, I know it sounds contradictory, but no, I don't mean to say that the book seems to depict the moment that we're living in now. What the book does for me is it's almost like it shines this very, very bright light on everything we've lost in terms of sort of quotidian social interaction, those glancing encounters that we don't have anymore with people, because we are keeping our distance, and we're wearing masks, and we're not in public spaces. And
yes, and of course these are things that we completely took for granted.
Yes.
Nobody was thinking, oh, how, if anybody had said a couple of months. Even now when I go outside and people here are wearing masks, and I go out and I see everyone with a mask, it's been happening for a long time now, but still every time it's jarring to me how weird it is, really. It's like, particularly because everybody was wearing a different kind of mask. So there's something surreal about going out into the same streets, into the same places, your neighborhood, seeing the same people, but they all are wearing these masks. It's almost like it's a costume party or something, because they're all matter of fact about it, right? They're just going about their business with these, these flamboyant things across their face.
I love the I love the idea of our life now as a sort of a strange little costume party in which we all wear a tiny costume that only covers this much of our body. I wanted to ask you about the title of the book. The book is called "What Are You Going Through?" and there's no question mark. I loved the fact that there was no question mark at the end of this question that is your title. I'm not sure if you made that choice deliberately, but the title also comes from a quote, and the quote is the epigraph of your book. It's from Simone Weil, and feel as though it touches on what we've been talking about here. These relationships we have with neighbors that we until very recently took for granted. All of these glancing interactions, this whole sort of fabric of our social life that doesn't just consist of, you know, our intimate relationships and our friendships and our partnerships, but all of these, you know, all of these like little tiny micro collisions we used to have every day with the person at the gym, or with our neighbor, or, you know, with the host of our Airbnb who we spend one evening talking to. And I was wondering, because you started this book obviously before now, what did that quote, can you talk about the quote from Simone Weil and talk about the role it played in this book? Was it part of the inception? Did it come later?
No, it was there from the beginning. I mean, I knew about this quote, which you know is the love of our neighbor simply consists in this, our being able to say, what are you true love of our neighbor consists in being able to say, what are you going through? I've known about it for a long time, and you know there is a question mark, but you know it seemed to me to be a very powerful and true thing to say, and I'm really not sure why exactly, because when I started the book I wasn't absolutely sure where I was going with it. I just, you know, jumped in, as it were, but I knew that it would be, you know, that it would be about people going through things, and it would be about a number of people going through things. So I don't know, that was it. As far as the question mark goes, I always knew there wouldn't be a question mark. I didn't really have to think hard about it. You know, very often when it is a question and you make it a title, you don't put the question mark in the title. I wish I could think of some titles right now, but when you have the title, it's more like a self-help book. Like, who stole my cheese? Question mark. Who moved my cheese, rather?
You're right. Without the question mark, it's much more, who moved my cheese?
Right. And the idea is like, what are you going through? I mean, there is an assumption that it's not a question. It's a statement. In other words,
Yes.
there's a human being, you know, that's another quote in the book, right? Usually attributed to Plato. Be kind, because everyone you meet is going through a hard time. Or sometimes translated, because everyone you meet is having a struggle. And it's just the same idea, you know, everyone you meet is going through something. And if you end up talking to them long enough, you will find that out, what that is. I mean, it could be some people are going through more of a struggle than others, but that was really the idea. And also but there's something kind of you know, that I do include that older Seidel movie, Jesus, you know, the kind of ironic aspect of it, like, you know, Jesus doesn't have a choice, you know, he has to listen, and these people in this film who are talking to Jesus, and they drone on and on and on and on and on, and they do become extremely tiresome, and also to some degree comic, which is why John Waters, who adored this movie, said that it showed if there really is a supreme being who listens, he must be going out of his mind, you know. So so in some cases the narrator is soliciting, or you know, is open to hearing, but other times she doesn't really have a choice. Somebody just starts in.
Right.
Yeah. And
Right.
she probably would rather not be there, but you know, but the kinder thing is to listen. And then you listen, it actually does become interesting. I mean, it does for me. I mean, I really also meant that for me when I say that in the book, that the narrator says she agrees with a certain playwright who said that no lives are really uninteresting or boring. No lives. Not if you really listen. Only sometimes you might have to listen for a really long time. And I do believe that that's true. I mean, a lot of people, they think people that, you know, surely there are boring people. I mean, Norman Mailer said that somewhere too. There are no boring people.
Well, I
And
think that this is something that as writers, we know that it's like an incredible, an incredible like benefit of being alive is that you're surrounded by people who are often very, very interesting, and we like glean for our work as you do. But I mean, talk more about the fact that your narrator does make the kind choice, because another reason that I thought that the book was so timely, again, in this inverse way, is because the book is depicting this stance toward your fellow human that seems to be really in short supply right now. This idea that we owe our neighbor compassion and listening is almost like a radical idea right now, Sigrid, because it's so little part of, I think, our like collective cultural understanding at this particular moment, when people just don't want to listen.
well, there's that, and also, something that's seems to be going completely out of the culture is the idea of forgiveness. Forgiveness is out. Um, but the thing about the narrator, though, which is a little bit frustrating, uh, is that there is a passivity. I mean, until things narrow down and she does find it in herself to help this old friend of hers, she's not really helping anybody. She's not like she has anything really helpful to say to this once beautiful woman who feels so terrible about the way she looks now. Or, I mean, it always ends with just, they said that and I listened, but it's not, and of course it helps people to listen to them, but it's almost like the least thing that one can
Mm-hmm.
do, listen. Um, because very often in life what happens is that you can't help anybody. You do feel helpless. I mean, somebody has lost someone has died. You can't bring that person back. I mean, there's, so, but then we always fall back on, on these kind of grimly boring, useless phrases like, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss." And then, "Is there anything I can do?" And it never really means, you're just saying that, I mean, unless it's somebody very close to you, of course. But I mean, people who they say, "Let me know if there's something I could do." It never feels sincere, even if maybe it is. So it's like, but if you actually really do listen, that's a lot that you can do. But it isn't, as I say, it's a frustrating thing, because you can't do any more than that. And that, the story then becomes like, even with her friend, there's a certain kind of dishonesty, because she says yes almost because she does at first, almost because she doesn't know how to say no. And
Right.
then she starts having doubts, and she feels like she has to tell her friend this. Like, I'm not so sure. I think maybe I made a mistake. And that's when her friend says, "Well, you know what? I'm going to take these euthanasia drugs anyway. And so if you're not going to be there, I'm going to do it anyway. But I don't have the time or energy to go down the list of all my friends and acquaintances." So, and then the friend, she's the narrator, is shamed to some extent, and then they go. But the first thing that she thinks when she gets there is, well, nobody says she's really going to take these drugs. She could change her mind. So then she's like completely in denial about it.
Well,
And
she
only at a
is.
certain point, yeah, she is.
But I mean, well,
She
first,
is.
I want
But
to I
then
want to jump
only at a
out
certain
quickly, just
point does,
for people
do
who might
things
not.
get kind of intensely focused.
Intensely focused
Okay.
between the two women.
Oh, something's wrong, at least for me.
Okay, I'm having a little trouble hearing Sigrid, but hopefully
Yeah,
that.
I think yeah. I had you froze, and then your voice got choppy, so I didn't hear the last thing that you said. Can
Okay,
you hear me?
well, I can hear you now, and hopefully our audience can hear us. And I'll rely on Maris to alert us if there's a consistent problem. I wanted to say that, for people who haven't read the book, and I don't think this is a spoiler at all, one of the remarkable things that happens in this book is that the narrator is asked by a friend if she will be present when this friend ends her own life. And I don't know, Sigrid, I disagree with you a little bit. I think that you're running your narrator down a bit in saying that she's not doing enough because she agrees kind of under duress. I mean, however she agrees, whether it's because she doesn't know how to say no or not, she still makes herself present to this person. And I thought that was it, and that's an extraordinary thing to do. And so I was curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that relationship between these two women, because it's so it's interesting to me that the woman who wants to end her life says to the narrator, well, don't think you were the first person I chose. You weren't on the top of my list. Right. And she also says, and I don't feel like going any further down either. So just do it. So I loved the fact that there's a randomness to it. It's not that the narrator is the perfect person to accompany her friend. She wasn't the first choice. Do you think that what kind of relationship is that? A relationship that's not quite intimate enough that you were the first choice, but at the same time you're still there for that person?
Well, it was all calculated in a way, because this is one of those typical friendships where when they were in school together, they were roommates and best friends, and they saw each other all the time, and that kind of girlfriend. And then years passed, and they stayed in touch, and they stayed friendly, but they lived in different towns. They didn't see each other that often. So by the time this happens, and this woman is diagnosed with cancer, and she goes to visit her in the hospital, she has to travel to do that. She hasn't seen her for a while, and they're not close friends anymore. But then when she first visits her, she's not terminal. She's just had a diagnosis. Then she decides to do treatment. The treatments don't work, and then at a certain point they say, we're sorry, the treatments aren't working. And then she just, you have maybe a year, and she decides, well, maybe I want to choose my own moment, and she gets the drugs. So she asks her closest friends, as she explains to them, she asks her two closest friends if one of them will be with her, and they say that they couldn't do it. That even though they understand how she feels, they would never be able to do that. They would try to stop her. So and then she's single at this point, and she has one child, her daughter, and they have never gotten along, really, from the time that the girl was a child, and she just feels that she can't. Her daughter, she says, would probably do it out of a sense of duty, but it was, as she puts it, it would just be too much of a mind fuck. I can't do that to her. Plus, she's the main beneficiary in my will. It's just too complicated. So then she said, I think that you would be better, because even though we're friends, we know each other, we understand each other, you haven't been in the habit of seeing me all the time.
Right. So the narrator is like this perfect person because she's not that close to her friend. She's close enough, but she's not too close. It was a very interesting kind of relationship, I felt, that you so kind of brilliantly illuminated in this book, this relationship between two women who end up sharing this incredible experience, which is the chosen end of one of the women's lives, in part because they're not that close. It's so interesting. Like you can't choose the person closest to you, and you can't choose a perfect stranger either. And our narrator is kind of this in between.
And it just made a kind of sense to me. I mean, the friend who has cancer, well, the narrator, when she asks the narrator to do this, they're in a bar, and the narrator says, she's so shocked at the request, and then she says, I just wish that you would have asked me this in some private, not in public. And her friend says, I did this on purpose because I didn't want us to get too emotional.
Right, right. She traps her in a way. I
Yeah,
mean, she knows in part that she needs the woman who wants to die needs the narrator to be kind of too shocked and embarrassed to say no in a way. She needs her to like not
right,
really be able to think about it.
right.
Um, I think that, yeah, I think that it's really interesting because, you know, stepping back from the two women whose relationship becomes, and everyone should read this book, I think, even just for the way in which this relationship, which, as we've been discussing, sort of starts out as one of these connections that's not particularly tight, the way it evolves as they go through this experience together, and the place that they end up, which you depict so beautifully. But I thought it was very interesting that both of these women have arrived at a point in their lives where their lives are not the way they had thought they would turn out, and you make that point very subtly, Sigrid, in the way that you make it about so many other women of a certain age. And I think as a woman of a certain age who you know recognized so much about myself in this book, I really wanted you to talk about women and women's lives and the way you depict them, because there's so many women, um, the major characters in this book, but also minor characters who wander through that the narrator doesn't really comment upon, whose lives have clearly not ended up the way they might have hoped. That this main character has a terrible relationship with her only child. The narrator has no kind of close connections. There's this ex of hers floating around who kind of comes in and out of the frame. The narrator meets a neighbor of hers who's an elderly woman who's all alone. A lot of older women alone in this book. Can you talk about that?
Well, again, it wasn't anything that I planned. You know, like, oh, I'm going to write a book and the characters will be such. But I just think it comes from observing lots of women that I know and have met.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I was always struck by how Virginia Woolf once said, "Only women's lives interest me."
Mm.
Um, you know, and I and it that you know that is interesting, and I wouldn't say that only women's lives interest me, but I will say that I am extremely interested in women's lives,
Yes.
and then I've known all these interesting women, and they're but also the two women and how they are and how they behave and their sensibilities and sense of, you know, particularly the one sense of humor and so on. I look at that and I absolutely know that my circle of female friends are in those characters. You know, like I'll think of someone, this person, whoever, and myself in this situation, and that the humor in it, that people say, you know, someone saying, you weren't my first choice, or okay, where should we go? I don't want to die in a red state. I mean, that is so much like something that's, you know, one of us would say. And then I realized that my whole life there have been these moments where there's been me and a friend and somebody has referred to us as Lucy and Ethel. I was doing an interview and the interviewer said to me, "So do you have an Ethel?" And I thought, so you just assume that I am Lucy.
Well, wouldn't you want to be Lucy?
Oh, I adore Lucy. I know, but it
I
just,
mean, Ethel's great too, but you're definitely Lucy.
but I just thought it was interesting to say, do you have an Ethel? But I mean, it just, you know, just situations that I've been in with people where someone has said, oh, Lucy and Ethel, you know, and in this case where her ex says it, laughs, he says, I shouldn't laugh, but it really is Lucy and Ethel do
Do
euthanasia.
euthanasia, yes,
You know,
which made me laugh out loud.
and that does remind me of, you know, of my friends. I mean, that's really where it comes from. Neither one of those people, I mean, my narrator, I've never been through all these things that happened to my narrator have not happened to me. But I completely identify with her sensibility and her way of looking at the world. And then this other person, this woman with a certain kind of, you know, the way she doesn't suffer fools, and the way she has to you know, inject humor into everything, and she is clever. and for example, the ex is kind of a foil to the ex is so sort of humorless. And
Mm-hmm.
then she, as she says, well, I hope you don't mind my saying, I never did like your ex. And then she says, what's he up to? And the narrator tells her about this lecture that he's giving, this very doomsday lecture
About the end of the world, and
at
it's
the end
too
of the
late to do a
world.
thing.
And the friend says, well, it's good to see he's still his old ball of fun self. That's, this voice is very strongly, very
Yes.
real to me. So certainly there isn't anyone I know who is sitting around with euthanasia drugs, or who is dying of cancer at the moment. But as I say, I just drew from the women I've known and the way they are for both of those characters, and it was a good feeling, particularly because of the humor, because of
Yes.
the um, uh, sort of an ability to see the comic, and not just the humor. I'm searching it, the irreverence also. Saying things that you don't say, that when she does that taping and that podcast and about people who have terminal illness, and the person doing the interviewing says, well, what does life mean to you? What's the meaning of life? And she says, well, the meaning of life is that it ends, just like as Kafka said. And then the interviewer says, no, but I mean in your own words, and she snaps, those are my words. I'm quoting Kafka. I mean, that kind of thing.
with words of my own, I'm
Yeah,
quoting
right. I
Kafka.
was told, right. And then, how will you feel? I won't feel anything. I'll be dead. This kind of, that also, I recognize the women in my life in that kind of behavior, and that kind of language.
It is, it is such a funny book, and the humor is, you're right. It's humor that's irreverent. It's Black humor. It's also really kind of unapologetic, in your face humor. And one of the things I love about this character, the one who's decided to die, is that she's just not interested in packaging herself for the edification of anyone. She
Right.
does this podcast, right, that you just mentioned. She's asked by a social worker at the hospital to give an interview about the experience of dying. And it's kind of like the narrator, right? The woman dying of cancer sort of says yes against her better judgment, and then gets trapped into doing this podcast, and
Right.
ends up having to perform the saintly role of the dying person. She just can't stand it. And
Right.
I loved how she just couldn't abide the nonsense of it.
Well, and also something else I was getting at there was that the narrator listens to the podcast when she's alone one time, and so she goes and she listens to other people who were also interviewed, and she gets somewhat disheartened because she feels that people are saying, these are people who are dying. That's why they're being interviewed, and they're being asked to express themselves. And she says they're saying what they think they should say.
Right.
They are saying what they think people want to hear. And, and then she thinks, they say that you're never really yourself except when you're alone. But who wants to be alone dying? But she feels that like these people are forced to be in a kind of situation where they can't really say what they really feel, because it would be unbecoming,
Right.
inappropriate.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. How lonely. What could be lonelier than, in death, not even getting to be yourself because you want to give others what they expect.
But that's actually our fault. Because the problem is that the reason why those people in their extreme situation don't tell the truth and tell you what you want to hear is because, and tell you what they think you want to hear, is because they sense that you don't want to hear the truth.
Right.
That they feel that. And I think people do let people down in this situation. I have a whole scene in the book about that, about a woman in a support group who talks about how she feels about her husband and his response to her dying, and everybody said, oh no, you're wrong, you're just reading it wrong.
It's an incredible scene. Yeah, everyone in the support group argues with this woman. They say like, no, your experience,
Yes.
you're actually misunderstanding your own
Exactly.
experience.
Exactly.
Sigrid, we have questions that are great, and let's get to them because they're great
It's time.
questions. Michelle Cormack has posed a question. She'd love for us to comment on creativity versus craft. Do you begin a project from one of those perspectives specifically? Is it the wild horses of creativity till they need to be reined in through craft, or something else altogether?
Oh, something else altogether, because I mean, that would be so daunting to think of beginning a book like that. So, I mean, I think you have to begin a book, in a very humble state of mind. I mean, do I have a story? Not do I have a big idea, but do I have a story?
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't, well, let's just put something down. Let's get a person down doing something, and from there move on. The hope is that if I put all my effort into it, it will be a work of, of imagination. It will be a creative
Mm-hmm.
work. And if I do the job of making sure that every sentence says what I wanted it to say as precisely as possible and as beautifully as possible, then I've achieved something with the craft. But
Mm-hmm.
that comes in the, in the writing. But I wouldn't start from there. No.
Right. Right. No, I think what you just said might be the single most valuable thing I've ever heard anyone say about writing, which is just start with a person doing something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just start with a person doing something. Dave King. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Dave.
Question for Sigrid. The first book of yours I read was Mitts, which I loved. I didn't know about Virginia Woolf's Flush at the time, and only many years later did I read it and think about it in the context of Mitts. How much were you thinking about Flush when you wrote Mitts? If you were aiming for some kind of frisson between the two books, can you talk about that?
Well, I mean, that book, long story short, that book started out as a book for children that somebody asked me to write. And I happened to know that the wolves had this pet monkey. So I thought, well, that would be an interesting children's story. And then I wrote these 3 little chapters and was told you can't write a children's book that doesn't have a child in it. So then, but then the publisher at that time said, but we actually would like you to write this, but we write it for adults. And that seemed very odd to me. I mean, why would adults want to read a children's book about a monkey? So then I thought, well, Virginia Woolf wrote this very beautiful book about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Cocker Spaniel called The Flush. It's a fabulous book, and she certainly didn't write it for children. It's just one of her novels. So I thought, okay, that's that's the kind of book that I want to write. So it had a tremendous influence, and I'd already read Flush, long before I started the book, and then I read it, and thought, yes, this is the highest achievement of this kind of book, Flush. Yeah.
Great question. Marco K says, hi, Sigrid. Do you feel that this novel is a spiritual successor to The Friend? How do you feel like this one is similar to or different from The Friend?
I think it's very similar. I mean, it's not an actual sequel, but I could tell from the very beginning when I started writing it that it came right out of The Friend. I was aware right away that it was the same narrator, and that it was the same sensibility and the same way of looking at the world. So yeah, I do. Some people have said they're even like companion pieces, and I to some extent, I think they are. The thing is, though, that The Friend actually came out of. I realized when I finished it that it was a lot like my first book, which was published in 1995. That narrator, the narrator of The Friend, is like the narrator of my first book, A Feather in the Breath of God, older. Again, it's the same sensibility, and it's the same way of looking at the world. It's the same tone, the same sort of intimate tone, and the same voice.
Yeah. One of my favorite books of all time, and one that I teach as often as I can, your first book. Lynn King asks, your novels tend to be quite short. Do you envision and plan out an arc first, or do the endings come organically?
I never plan anything when I'm writing a book. I start and then I move on, and everything builds from the material that I already have, so that by the time I revise it many times as I go along, so that by the time I get to the end, except for the editing that needs to be done, and some revision, it's done. And
Mm-hmm.
I usually don't know what the ending is going to be, as in this book. I did not know how this book was going to end until I got there. I did not know how The Friend was going to end until I got there. I might have an idea as I'm writing. Oh, I know how I know what's going to happen towards the end. I know what the ending will be, but very often that isn't what happens.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I'm hoping, my hope is that everything will grow organically out of what's come before.
And I think that makes for an incredibly organic experience of reading also, because I have to say, with this book, I could never, even down to the last sentence, imagine what the next sentence would be. And that's my favorite kind of reading, when each sentence is unexpected in some way. And that's what this book was like for me. Dillis asks or says, I really enjoy reading your new novel on Kindle. I hope that it will have a Chinese edition soon in China, like The Friend. Will
I
it?
hope so too. Yes, I certainly hope so. Yes.
I do too. Jenna, thank you, Dillies. Jenna asks or says, the book just arrived, so this question may be off the mark. Was it scary or depressing to write it?
Oh, it wasn't depressing. I mean, that's the thing. That's the whatever the word is. I mean, it doesn't really matter how sad and upsetting the material is. If you're writing about it, it turns into something else. There's again Virginia Woolf, who had a lot of trouble in her life, and she talked about how writing, putting one thing and another together, it was the greatest pleasure that she knew. And also it gives you a sense of ordering material, but it's meditative, it's soothing. I mean, it doesn't matter how hard the actual work is. Overall, I would never call it depressing, except maybe there are depressing days when nothing's working, but overall, no, I can imagine writing a piece of journalism where you really have to tell the truth of a terrible situation that could be deeply depressing. But a novel, a story, fiction, something that you're making up, if I was getting depressed, or it was getting depressing, I just make one of my jokes, or drop a bunny rabbit in there or something, I mean, I would do something to lighten things up. And scary, no. In fact, I would say that writing probably helped me with that particular book, where it helped me with my own fears about illness and dying, in fact. I mean, that could be an illusion, but I did feel that I was coming to terms with certain things when I wrote the book.
It feels that way to me. I was, reminded when I was reading your book of, I recently read this translation of Rilke's The Duino Elegies, and the introduction makes this sort of like very grand statement about Rilke, to the effect that, few writers ever engage with the subject of death, but Rilke does. And I thought, well, Sigrid does too. and actually really well. And I mean, death has been your subject in this book and the previous book. And I mean, it feels to me as if you've engaged with that really difficult subject in a way that makes it easier for me to think about death and dying. And do you feel that was true for you?
I do. And of course, I write under the influence of Rilke, so he does deserve some credit there.
I'm not denying Rilke any credit. He's pretty good. I think his stuff is also enjoyable.
Yeah, but I mean credit for my writing about that.
Yeah.
Yes, to answer that question. Now I lost the question, but
I'm going to selfishly ask another question of mine because you reminded me of it. But when you said, you made a very funny gesture just now about like if the writing got too distressing, maybe you would just put in a joke or bunny ears. And I immediately realized that I didn't get a chance to ask you about a certain character in this book who tells an incredibly moving story and is a cat. And could you just say a little about this character who I really loved and who's on the cover?
Well, I did the cat. I didn't, again, wasn't planning on putting a cat in there or any animal at all. But I got to a certain point, and I had the Airbnb, the person who owns the Airbnb, did lose her cat, and she decides to replace it. So she's got a new kitten. So the second time my narrator goes to that Airbnb, there is this little kitten, and she says, he's very rambunctious, so you should make sure your door is closed. So of course the narrator leaves the door open, and the cat comes in and jumps on the bed and is purring and needing the duvet, and my narrator is very sleepy, and is this a dream or is this cat really talking? I mean, the cat then has a story, just like other people have told their story. This is what the cat has been going through. And, this is a rescue cat. And so it was incredibly easy to imagine if the cat could speak and tell its story, this is the kind of story that it would tell. And then when I finished it, it seemed like a very strange thing to have in there, but people have really been so taken by that cat. Readers have been incredibly taken by that cat. And so I'm glad that I was able to include, and it also made sense to me at that time. I'm talking about, all these different kinds of people and what they're going through. And it just made some kind of sense to include at least some non-human being and give it a voice and a story of what it, particularly, it has a happy ending. I would never have included a story about an animal in that particular situation in that book if it did not have it had bad things happen, but it has a very happy ending.
Yes. I was very grateful for the ending of the cat story, but I was just really grateful for the cat. I'm one of the readers who I loved the cat, and the cat made absolute sense to me. And I guess that's all I'll say. And readers who haven't read the book should experience the cat and the cat's story, which the cat does tell in exactly the way that you would expect a cat to tell its story. I wanted to just get through some other questions and comments. Dilly's question, actually, we've already addressed, but they've asked, I find that someone says that your latest novel is a sequel to The Friend in theme. Do you agree? And I think you felt that you did agree that they are.
About that. Yeah, I wouldn't call it a sequel, but it did grow out of The Friend.
Yes.
They are very similar books.
Yes. Judith writes, not much of a question, more a statement of gratitude. In your books, you make references to other authors, i.e. a reference in The Friend that made me rush out to read Coelho. Thanks for your generosity. And that's actually a comment that makes me want to ask you another one of my questions that I had here in reserve, which is what sort of reading do you do while you're working? What's your relationship to reading while you're writing? Do you read certain authors? Do you avoid certain authors?
Well, I don't. You hear from a lot of writers that they can't read while they're writing, or even you shouldn't read other writers while you're writing, but I have given up a lot in order to be able to write. There is one thing I will not give up, and that is reading, because what would be the point? I mean, that I will not give up. And so I have to do it, I have to, and yes, what happens, what I would avoid, I wouldn't read, a whole bunch of Nabokov all in a row while I was trying to write, because he has such a strong style. Flannery O'Connor would be another one.
Yeah.
But I read whatever I want, and sometimes I do write something and say, oh, that doesn't sound like me, that sounds like the person I'm reading. But you read something, you read pretty quickly, and you're on to something else, so you don't give it time to corrupt or whatever, your style. And I don't, yeah, and then what happens is that I'll think of something while I'm writing, and I'll think, oh, I should go read that book because I seem to have
Mm.
some memory that it has something to do with this, and I'll do that. And then sometimes there's like when I wrote, I loved the reading that I did for Rowena, because I didn't know anything about what it was like to be a U.S. Army nurse in Vietnam. And I read all these books about Vietnam and about nurse. I didn't know what it's like to be a nurse.
Yeah.
And that was really wonderful. And then there were all the movies that I hadn't seen. So that was really very enjoyable. But so I just read whatever I want to read.
Well, that's a great segue to one of our two final questions, which I'm going to take in reverse order of their appearance in the chat. So the question is, what are you reading right now, from Daniel?
Right now, I am reading Harry Kunzru's book, which has just come out, I believe, called Red Pill. And I am enjoying it very much.
Red pill or blue pill?
Red Pill.
No, I know. I was trying to channel, what is it? It's from the Matrix. It's an allusion to the Matrix, right? You get to choose one of the two pills.
Yes.
I haven't decided yet which one I want. And a last question, and I want to just pause to thank everyone who asked a question, and also thank everyone who's made a comment. Not everything in the chat is a question. Thank you, those of you who have meowed and echoed my adoration of the cat. Some people have actually issued an urgent request for a sequel starring the cat. And we'll end with a question from Dilys. Could you share anything about your new novel or your plans for your next novel?
I have not been writing a new novel. Okay, so I finished this book last September, actually. Like everybody else, I find it very hard to carry on these days. Given what's going on, I did start writing something. It was a story that I started writing in the middle of the pandemic, and found myself unable to write any fiction. So I just feel like, everything is changing so much and so drastically and quickly, and we've got an enormous crises ahead. It's not like we're just waiting for a vaccine and then that will. There's all this other stuff things that you can't get a vaccine for, terrifying things. I
cultural
feel
diseases.
Exactly, and I feel like I have to wait and see how I've changed and how the world has changed before I can figure out a way to write about it, or if to write at all. So I'm not really working on anything right now. I mean, I hope that will change, but it's hard to imagine right now, to be honest.
I hope it'll change, and I think it will. But I echo your. I get it. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard right now. It feels like we're waiting, and I hope we're waiting for good things as well as challenging things. Thank you so much, Sigrid.
Here.
Here's Maris.
Thank you.
I wanted to thank both of you, Susan, Sigrid. This was such a delightful evening. Thank you to everyone in the audience for being great. And
thank you, everybody.
Buy books.
Buy books. That's buy books and vote.
Buy books and vote.
Yes.
Do those two things.
Get your flu shot. Get your flu shot.
Yes. Okay, 3 things. Buy books, vote, get your flu shot. That's easy homework, and it will make the world a better place.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Sigrid.
Bye-bye.
Sigrid, I can't wait to drink a glass of wine together.
Yeah. In the future. Yeah.
I await that future. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.